Okay, welcome to our 31st Reading Online Sport Economics Seminar. I forgot what the acronym stood for a moment there. Thank you everyone for joining us. These are seminars that we organise in a time of COVID-19 when we're not able to meet in person. We've had folk from all around the world presenting. We've been so happy to have all sorts of different presentations from different parts of the world, far-flung places. And this week we have a presentation from Reading. So I'm delighted to be welcoming Mobolaji Alabi, who is in the ICMA Centre with us at the University of Reading, and he's going to present on the financial consequences of the financial fair play. I'm slightly paraphrasing your title now, Mobolaji. But what I'll do is I'll let you take it away from here. And if you are on the call, please do mute your microphones. And there'll be about an hour for Mobolaji to talk, and then there'll be about 30 minutes for Q&A. And please do feel free to use the chat if you want to join the talk, or if you can't use the chat and want to ask questions, you're welcome to drop me an email as well. All yours, Mobolaji.
All right. Thank you so much, James. I'll just start presenting, and are my slides visible?
Yep, we can see them.
Oh, fantastic. You can hear me perfectly, right?
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much, James, for setting this up and for this opportunity. I'm going to be presenting today on some work in progress that we have, and it's titled The Financial Impact of Financial Fair Play Regulation, Evidence from the Premier League. Yes, so my details are there at the ICMA Center. The presentation is going to follow the pattern of the usual pattern, so an introduction and a motivation, and then I'll get to literature, data, method, results, and discussion. Yeah, so I'll just dig right into it now. So for those who are not really familiar with the Premier League or UEFA competitions, financial fair play was a regulation that was introduced announced in 2009 and came into force in 2011. And it's majorly for clubs that are playing in UEFA competitions. UEFA has two broad competitions that countries, or rather the clubs from different countries play in. Clubs from different countries in Europe. That's the UEFA Champions League and also the Europa League, which was called the UEFA Cup in time past. So I'll start with a quote from the who is late now, the UK sports minister, Tony Banks. And he said this in, I think, 1998 or so. And he said, they think the goose is going to keep on laying the golden eggs, that it will never stop. Well, I don't buy into that. It could so easily all go very wrong. I don't think that football has fully digested or understood many of the big money changes that have been going on recently. So the backdrop of this was, okay, my next slide would explain this. So this table here shows the broadcast deal, and the broadcast deals, the historic broadcast deals. So for football clubs, they make money in different ways. One of the major ways is broadcast deals from televising. And the Premier League broke away from the English National League in 1992. And so you can see here in the first year, in 1992 through to 1997, the broadcast deal was about 232 million for a 5-year period. And the next period was 1997 to 2001, which was for a 4-year period, and it had more than doubled, almost tripled actually. And it was around this time that he made that comment and said, a lot of money is going into football and we need to really watch out. This quote is by Stefan Szymanski, who I think is on the call, and he said, Leeds flew too close to the sun in trying to win the Champions League. And Leeds United is an English football team who around in the early 90s were very successful, and they rivaled Manchester United for different trophies and other clubs. And but they went into administration in 2004. And prior to going into administration is literally a situation where they cannot meet their financial obligations. Prior to going into administration, Leeds United had been successful on the pitch. They reached the semi-finals and they wanted to win it, and then they were spending, buying more players. And I mean, it only makes sense when you have increased money from broadcast deals. And this was one of the reasons why Tony Banks said football needs to come to terms with the amount of money that is going in. In 2001, Leeds had a net book value or book value for their players, which was to the tune of 198 million. By 2001, when they started facing financial struggles, they had to sell some of those star players, and then they were only able to raise about 50 million. And bear in mind that the book value of football players is nowhere close to their actual values, because the purchase of players has nothing to do with the historical cost, but actually the current value. And for financial reporting reasons, the current value of intangible assets as football players are not reported in the financial statements because it's very difficult to determine their value. So from book value of 198 million in 2001, they sold these players for a combined 50 million, I think in 2003 or 2. Yes, 2002. Leeds United were champions in 1992, and by 2004, they were relegated due to financial issues. So they had to sell all their players, and as they sold all their players, the team was not as strong enough to compete. But, I mean, there are a lot of other instances where this happened. We have Parma from Italy, Deportivo La Coruña from Spain, who were very good also and were competing at some point in the Champions League and fell into financial issues. Portsmouth FC was the first Premier League club to go into administration in 2010. More recently, we've had cases, more financial issues. So Bury FC, Wigan FC, and Bolton. These are some of the most recent issues, financial issues that have happened. Because of this, a lot of football clubs, or rather recently, we have started hearing things around Project Big Picture, where Manchester United and Liverpool are trying to adjust the structure of the Premier League to ensure, I mean, for various reasons, but one of the reasons they put forward was to help other clubs to, position them for sustainability. And this has been fought, and at this moment in time, Project Big Picture has been put on the back burner. The question then becomes, why do clubs overspend? Because that's what happened to Leeds United. Leeds United were doing so well, they started overspending, trying to buy players and to remain competitive. So the real question is, why do clubs even overspend? Stefan Szymanski, Forrest, and Simmons in 2002 in a study showed that there's a high correlation between spending and then sporting success. So it's a situation where clubs that have spent high amounts of money in the past have recorded significant sporting success. This leads to something that George Akrelov, 1976, said, a rat race scenario. And the rat race scenario simply is the amount of cheese available for each rat that is running is limited. However, each rat has to put in much effort to get to that cheese. So that's Muller et al. Linked this phenomenon to the reason why clubs overspend in a bid to achieve sporting success. Another reason is soft budget constraint. Soft budget constraint simply means that clubs, or rather firms, would spend as much as possible when there's no consequence of them going bust. So it's more or less like what happens in the banking sector, where you know that you will definitely get bailed out, and that's why clubs keep on spending. In the football scenario, that has happened because most times you have rich owners who can bankroll some of these clubs. And also even in times when banks used to lend money to football clubs, which has really reduced at this present point in time, because of the high demand of football entertainment, these clubs were able to renegotiate their debt and also still get additional debt. So that's one of the reasons. So soft budget constraint, more or less like it's almost a scenario of they were too big to fail. Another reason put forward by Peters and Szymanski is the structure of European football. The structure of European football allows for promotion and relegation. So because of that promotion and relegation, clubs overspend in order to stay put. Remember the table that I put up there with the broadcast deal. The broadcast deal has been increasing every single year. So in order to get a larger share of that broadcast revenue, clubs fight tooth and nail to stay within the highest leagues. Now, this is a quote by Michel Platini, who was, I think, UEFA president at that point in time, and he said, numerous football clubs, including some prestigious ones, have experienced severe financial difficulties, leading to top division clubs reporting aggregate losses again. And so it had been happening several times, but in 2010, it had gotten to a very, very horrible place. And the question then becomes, why did this happen? So it was a situation where clubs had reported significant revenue, but at the same time, they were reporting significant losses. Rising debt because clubs were increasingly borrowing in order to fund the existing wage bill, what they're paying to the players, and then cost of acquisition of better talents. This led to a situation where they had negative equity, where the debts were larger than their assets. And then for some of them, insolvency came into play, inability to pay their financial obligations. An interesting situation came up where we had sugar daddy financing, a situation where a rich owner, regardless of the losses the club is making, kept on pumping in money in a bid to achieve sporting success. Just a few highlights of the figures. In 2009, collectively in the top division of European football, clubs generated in excess of about 11.7 billion in revenue. In that same period, the Eurozone had an inflation figure of about 0.3%. So you can see that the football industry was in a league of its own because of, the excess demand, and fans were ready to pay premium for it, and which has actually even gone up as of today. In this same period, they had losses of 1.2 billion, which was an 85% increase from the previous year. Clubs spent which translates to about €6 for every €5 of revenue they received. About 68% of their revenue was spent on player-related costs. So about 68% of whatever they were earning, they spent on wages. Debt had risen to about 8.2 billion, which was a 6% increase from the previous year, and net debt was about 6.3 billion. This put clubs in a very, very bleak financial situation. About 14% of clubs in Europe had qualified audit opinion relating to going concern. So the auditors felt that if things did not improve, clubs will probably not exist in the future, and which was why Michel Platini made the statement he made. In 2009, UEFA announced a set of regulations. Prior to this, there had been no financial regulation, even though UEFA had come up with a club licensing arrangement. So for any club that wanted to play in any of UEFA's competition, they had to apply for a license to play in that competition. However, there was no requirements, there was no financial requirement. There were sporting requirements and also coaching requirements that clubs had to show that they were doing well in. However, there was no financial requirement or no proper financial requirement. So in 2009, UEFA announced that financial fair play regulation was going to be introduced and come into force in 2011. So it was announced in 2009 and came into force in 2011. And the overarching objective of financial fair play was to improve profitability and to also encourage sustainability of European football. Question is, what is financial fair play? Financial fair play, the hallmark of financial fair play is the break-even requirement. So the break-even requirement is UEFA requiring clubs to show that their operating performance, or rather their financial performance, is up to scratch. And in doing this, UEFA defined I'll just go back again. Break-even requirement requires for clubs to not make losses above €5 million per season. So that's what the break-even requirement was. And in determining what break-even requirement was, UEFA defined what could constitute break-even requirements. So they defined it as relevant income and relevant expenses. And the reason why they did this is because, if you remember what I said that rich owners were able to pump in money. So UEFA, by bringing in relevant income and expenses, prevented this, because what is relevant income? They defined it as commercial income, which is exploitation of the brand. So some of the brand deals they had, advertising deal, broadcast revenue, which was from the TV broadcasters, and then match day revenue, which is what clubs get on the day. So ticket sales and also hospitality packages. And for relevant expenses, not all expenses were allowed for financial fair play. So things like youth team development expenses were excluded from the break-even requirement, because UEFA was trying to encourage clubs to invest in the youth, and then also in women's football. Now, UEFA gave a money, rather than just, so the break-even requirement is spread over 3 years. What that means is that UEFA assesses each club's financial performance over 3 years. And so that means, for the first year of 2011, clubs were not going to be assessed in 2011, but by 2013. So 2013, 2012, and 2011. So it came into force in 2011, but it was always going to be retrospective, 3 years retrospective. And then the acceptable deviation was 5 million euros per team per season. And there's a caveat there where clubs are, or rather the owners are able to cover about 30 million euros every season. So so I'll give an example. If a club makes 45 million euros loss in a season, 35 million euros loss in a season, the owners can inject in 30 million as equity to cover up this loss. The lifeblood of any regulation is sanctions. So UEFA attached some sanctions. The first, warnings, fines, and also withheld revenue, player registration restrictions, and then also suspension from competitions. Recently, there was the case between UEFA and Manchester City, where Manchester City was suspended from UEFA competition, but this was overturned by CAS. Who must abide by financial fair play? There are about 700 clubs within the top division in Europe. However, only about 235 play in UEFA competitions. So UEFA only requires teams that are going to play in UEFA competitions to abide by financial fair play. So, for example, in Germany, only I think there are about 4 clubs that qualify for Champions League, and I think they run a 20 league system. So 4 clubs only are exposed to financial fair play in a given year. Are there any similarities with what UEFA has done, or similarities in other footballing regions and in other sports? Yes, so we have in the MLS, there's something called the draft system and a salary cap. So the draft system is around transfers, and then the salary cap limits, which is also called the Beckham rule or designated player rule, limits how much you can pay a player per season. And then the draft system gives, in terms of player transfer, some clubs, so it's more or less like a central system where young players are allocated to different teams rather than clubs going ahead to buy players themselves, at least just for young players. Then also in terms of, in the MLS also, gate receipts are shared. There's a fixed percentage. Whereas in European football, the gate receipts for any match day is given solely to the club that is playing at home. Broadcast rights are shared equally in the MLS, but in the Premier League or even in Europe, they're not shared equally. So it's based on sharing formulas. In rugby, there's a salary cap, which was introduced to improve the financial performance of rugby clubs. And there was a recent case with Saracens where they were adjudged to have tried to circumvent the salary cap regulation. In recent times in the EFL, that's the league just below the Premier League, a salary cap was introduced because of a lot of clubs in the EFL had suffered significant financial losses and were facing liquidity issues. The question then becomes, is UEFA's approach better? Because UEFA is not introducing a salary cap directly, and they're not reducing they're not telling clubs how much they can spend. What they're just telling clubs is spend within your means. So the break-even requirement, which says that, and then that limitation of the amount of losses you can make, is indirectly telling clubs you cannot spend beyond what you earn. So that's the approach UEFA has taken. I'll start with an interesting quote by Szymanski. Once upon a time, every nation had a Ministry of War, and now it's called Ministry of Defense. So in his paper, when he was analyzing how effective financial fair play is, he's talking about names and how it was a masterstroke that UEFA introduced their regulation as a financial fair play. So implicitly, financial fair play is not just a financial measure, but it's a measure to increase competitive balance, to ensure that there's a level playing field for all clubs. Interestingly, he made mention of United Nations, and he said that United Nations is not so united. So names really might not necessarily show the whole picture of things. So that was the point he was trying to make in that paper. So the question then is financial fair play, is it actually fair in terms of competitive balance, and even in terms of finances? Does it skew things to clubs that are existing big clubs? So those are some of the questions that he asked. And in his paper, he said that financial fair play looks more or less like an efficiency thing rather than a redistribution of income. So remember that in football, the more you spend, the more likely you are to succeed. So a situation where you have redistribution of income would level the playing field, like what is happening, like what is currently, or what we currently have in the MLS in the United States. But Szymanski argues that financial fair play does not in any way redistribute income. Peters and Szymanski, what they did was to simulate the effects of financial fair play in some leagues, and that was for the 2010 and 2011 season. And what they found, so using the definition of break-even requirement and then what clubs were currently earning in that period, they found that what financial fair play might do is to reduce wages spent on players. And I think their model estimated that wages will reduce between 8 and 15%. And then to more or less shift rent to the owners, because the owners will have profitability that, or rather profits that they can keep. So they believe that, or rather they simulated that break-even requirements could actually improve the profitability of football clubs. Budzinski, 2014, criticized financial fair play and said that it's more or less like a barrier to entry, because it more or less prevents sugar daddies from taking over some of these big clubs. So questions around whether financial fair play contravenes EU competition laws came up. The lawyer who, there's a lawyer, he's called Mr. Dupont, I think, if I'm not mistaken. He actually tested this out, and I think the courts allowed FFP to work, or rather to be used. Sars, Vopel, Frank all spoke about competitive balance, and what their assessment of financial fair play is that financial fair play is going to ossify, or rather is going to give an ossification in the European Football Club. And what this means is that existing clubs that are big will remain big, whereas smaller clubs would remain small. And the thinking behind this is by limiting what clubs can spend, the clubs that are already big have a kitty, or rather have, because I mean, the more you win, the more your match day revenue goes up, the more you have higher percentage of distribution from broadcast deals, and then the more you have from commercial income, because successful teams attract commercial deals with big brands. So their argument is that financial fair play is going to lead to ossification and was not going to improve competitive balance in European football, contrary to what its name says. Proust et al. In 2013 said that financial fair play might lead clubs to start creatively manipulating the books. And their thinking behind this was, when you ask clubs, or rather, match day revenue is difficult to manipulate in a way. Broadcast revenue is difficult to manipulate. However, commercial deals are easier to manipulate because, even though financial fair play, UEFA introduced a fair value system of assessing how reasonable some of these commercial deals are. But I mean, it's still something very difficult. And we can see from the case with Manchester City versus UEFA in 2020, and we can see how UEFA allegedly accused Manchester City of allegedly falsifying sponsorship deals. So Proust et al. 2013 correctly identified this as a potential criticism, a potential loophole for clubs to use to manipulate. So in terms of whether, I mean, so there's a lot of theoretical arguments against financial fair play. However, some Freestone and Manoli in 2017 assessed whether financial fair play has led to increased competitive balance in the English Premier League, and their findings suggest that there's increased competitive balance. Clubs are, I mean, so what they did was to look at points, I think points and then goals scored, and then they found that competitive balance has increased. So that was the measure they used there. Plumley et al. Studied competitive balance in the top 5 leagues in Europe, and they found that competitive balance had reduced in Spain, Germany, and France, but they didn't find any evidence of that in England and Italy. So that's consistent with Freestone and Manoli. So in England, it seems as though clubs are more competitive. I mean, when I was reading this paper, I was thinking about how Italy, because I mean, if I'm not mistaken, Juventus has won the last 9 titles in Italy. However, it's not just about winning the title. So it's in terms of, they looked at measures in terms of goals scored, points to win the league, and those are some of the measures they used to find out competitive balance. Gallagher and Quinn looked at the effects of financial fair play in England and found that clubs in England have shifted from a sporting efficiency perspective to a financial efficiency perspective. And so they found that increasingly clubs are taking decisions, or rather financial decisions, or rather their decisions are more geared towards financial efficiency than sporting efficiency. In terms of the real effects of financial fair play, Caglio et al. Studied the top 5 European leagues, and they found that financial fair play has actually improved profitability. So those are I think that's the earliest study that looks at the effects of financial fair play on profitability. There's a theory that was put forward. That's the real effects hypothesis by Kanodia and Sapra. It says that more or less like measurements, when you ask managers to measure and disclose certain matrices, they would, by extension, what would then happen is that those managers will start taking decisions that improve that metric. So that's the hypothesis. So if you ask football clubs to disclose their break-even results, they will take active steps to ensure that those break-even results are positive. So that's the hypothesis that this work in progress is looking to test. Napier 2020 studied the real effects of the adoption of IFRS in Europe, and their findings is that that's the financial reporting standard for revenue recognition, and they found that the new financial reporting standard does not improve the disclosure or does not improve the metrics, that's income metrics. However, they realized that what happened is that those companies, what some of those companies did was to spend more money on computer softwares in order to actually present the appropriate financial figures in accordance with IFRS 15. Williams and Williams also looked at the same thing in terms of how tax laws impact innovation. And they found that the tax laws have actually reduced the spending on innovation. So for our research question, is Gianni Infantino once said that he was of UEFA. He's currently the FIFA president. Said that financial fair play is about sustainability in Europe, and he believes that the break-even requirements will lead to more competitive and sustainable football sector. So our focus is actually on sustainability in the football sector. So we're not looking at competitive balance. We have seen other studies, as I mentioned, that looked at competitive balance. So our question is, has financial fair play improved the finances of football clubs in the EPL. And the reason why we look at the EPL is that the EPL is where clubs have the most in terms of revenue, most in terms of broadcast deal, and ironically, they've had the highest amount of losses reported. And also in terms of debt levels, the debt levels in the Premier League is very, very high. And that's why we are focused on the English Premier League. So the first question is, has profitability improved? So this is going to be measured by the break-even requirement. And has financial sustainability improved? In order to do this, we collected the financial information for 37 clubs in the EPL between 2005 and 2019. And we did this to have pre and post data. So pre-financial fair play, which came into force in 2011, and post-financial fair play data. That's from 2011 to 2019. So the source of our data was from club websites. So some of the clubs put their financial statements on their website, and some others don't. And we had to get the financial information from the company house records. That's the clearinghouse for companies in the United Kingdom. Now, we had to do a lot of data. We had to look at some of the, because some of the clubs have complex group structures. So you can have a situation where some clubs run holdco structures. So you can have the subsidiary company, the parent company. So we had to actually look at which of these companies presents the accurate and most useful financial information for the operations of the clubs. So for example, Arsenal Holdings PLC and Arsenal Football Club. So Arsenal Holdings PLC was the holding club, whereas Arsenal Football Club PLC was the subsidiary. And one of the things we found out was that Arsenal Football Club, which is the subsidiary, did not have the financial information in relation to the Emirates Stadium. So, but that financial information was present in the holdings company. So we picked the parent company in that for Arsenal. And the good thing is that the subsidiary information more or less mirrored the parent company, aside from the only difference was around the stadium. For Manchester United, so Manchester United PLC is the holding company, whereas Red Football Limited is the subsidiary. We picked the subsidiary because in 2005 and 6 and I think 7, the holding company did, because of the restructuring from the bid, or rather from the takeover by the Glazers, we couldn't find accurate financial information for the holding company. So we picked the subsidiary company. And likewise, just like Arsenal, the financial information for the subsidiary and the parent were very, very similar. So we have consistency there. So we looked at information from the income statement, balance sheet, cash flow statement, and notes to the financial statement to be able to replicate the break-even requirement. In terms of transfer fees paid, it's easy to find that for players. However, transfer fee received is very difficult. And then what we have in the media is not reliable. However, Kieran Maguire, in his book, gave a detailed way on how to work back and to find out the accurate amount that was received by each football club. So we use that in determining our amounts received for transfer of football players. So this is an extra from Manchester City's annual accounts. So this is the consolidated financial, consolidated profit and loss. So you can see here that they have turnover. So that's where broadcast, commercial, and match day income is housed in turnover. And this is how they present the financial information. However, there are a lot of income here and also expenses that are not allowable by financial fair play. So we had to look at the notes. This is an extract from the Everton's annual accounts. And the extract shows intangible asset. That's where players' contract sits in. So we had to look at that. And then the cash flow statement. This is where the amount of cash flow the club has generated is housed. And then this is an extra from Leicester City's 2019 account, which shows the notes. So you can see here that broadcast rights are clearly shown here. Sponsorship and advertising income is shown here. Gate receipts are shown here also. Definition of relevant income and expenses, we proxied BER. Wages as a percentage of revenue, We also proxied that. Player expenses. So player expenses is wages as well as annual transfer fees as a percentage of revenue. We proxied that. Cash flow to debt, cash flow to total debt ratio. We also use that. That's the measure that we use to look at financial sustainability. So this is the breakdown that's for all the clubs in our data set, 37. So we can see how broadcast revenue has increased significantly in our data set. Match day revenue has more or less stayed within the same region. Commercial revenue has also increased, but not as fast as broadcast revenue. So we can see how already from this that broadcast revenue is a big game changer for clubs in the English Premier League. Player expenses, you can see every single year that wages and salaries has gone up. The amount that's been spent on transfers annually has also gone up. By the way, the transfer, this is an annual amount, so this is actually not the amount that clubs spend in the year. This is, so for example, if Manchester United signed Harry Maguire for £80 million, it's spread over 5 years, or the amount on the years of his contract. So if it's 5 years, that would mean that 80 over 5 is what is put as the annual transfer charge. So when we have a look here, we can see that this is relevant income and expenses. And we can see that relevant income prior to 2011 was always below relevant expenses. But from 2011, I mean, still almost the same thing, but starts to go up, starts to measure up. In 2017 and 18, it goes above relevant expenses, but as at 2019, had gone back down. So this is for all the clubs in our data set. For wages as a percentage of revenue, always went up, and there was a sharp reduction in 2014. And coincidentally, in 2014 is when the broadcast revenue went up very high. So that's why we can see this fall. So it's not as though wages went down, revenue actually went up. So for transfers, so this is the net amount that was paid out or received by clubs. And we can see that the amount transfer fee has always been higher than transfer fees paid has always been higher than transfer fee received for all the clubs. And we can even see that post implementation of financial fair play in 2011, it went up at a very high rate. So we can see here, this is the assets, debt, and cash flow. And prior to financial fair play, they were more or less the same, but subsequently total assets increased. And the total assets that increase is majorly because clubs spent more on buying players, and these players are actually regarded as assets. Cash flow has more or less stayed within the same range, but in 2017 it went up considerably. So for a visualization on the break-even results, this is what we have here. So this is the total. So you can see here that prior to financial fair play, it was going down. And in 2011, I mean, you can't really tell whether it went up sometimes and went back down, went up. So this is for all the clubs in our data set. So in terms of the descriptive statistics, this is what we have. So you can see here that the break-even requirement, the highest that we had was 141 million. So all figures here are in millions. And the lowest that we had was 191 million in losses. So we have other variables, commercial revenue, and we can see here that, yes, so the highest amount for broadcast revenue is 260 million, and commercial revenue was 271 million. You can see that cash flow to debt, the percentage was very high for, the highest was about 182%. And you can see here that wages were very high also, 332 million. Yeah, so that's the descriptive statistics. In terms of our correlation matrix, so our key variable is break-even requirement. But you can see here that almost every other variable is not highly correlated with it, with our break-even. However, we have not included any of this in our regressions, and these are some of the reasons. I mean, we're open to suggestions on how we can exploit the fact that there's no high correlation with this, and to also have good results. I'm open to suggestions and comments. So the method that we've used is the difference approach for causal effect to see whether financial fair play has had a positive impact on whether it has had a positive impact on the financial performance. One of the key things for difference in difference is that you have your treatment and your control group. So we do that. So in other natural experiments, you do not the key difference for difference in difference is that it's a natural experiment. However, when you're determining your treated and control group, it's not randomized. So the researcher is the one who determines what goes into treated and control group. And based on our definition, which we'll mention later, we determine which clubs should go into treated and control groups. So another thing is the planned intervention, which here is our financial fair play, which was introduced and came into force in 2011. The SOTFA assumption is very key also. So in terms of the consistency of the regulation and ensuring that there's no spillover. The treated group, or rather the control group, is not exposed to the treatment. So that's what SOTFA tells us. And we also have the common trend assumption. And the common trend assumption is more or less what leads to the counterfactual. So the difference in difference, we're trying to look at whether there's a difference between our outcome variable between the treated and control group before and after the introduction of the regulation. However, because we cannot know what would have happened to the treated group if the regulation had not been introduced, we have to rely on the counterfactual. So for our model specification, this is the model we used, a simple DID model where we have the target, post, and then the interaction term. So the target is a dummy variable, and it's 1 for clubs exposed to financial fair play and 0 for those not. Post is 1 for the years after the introduction of financial fair play and 0 for the years before financial fair play was introduced, and then the interaction term. So for our baseline definition, what we have done is to define clubs in the target group. And the reason why we mention target is that it's financial fair play is actually aimed at improving profitability across all clubs. However, not all clubs have to keep it. And so that's why we've defined it as target as opposed to treated group. And this is consistent with what Caglio 2019 did in the analysis of financial fair play in the real effects of financial fair play in the 5 European leagues. So our baseline definition of target clubs is clubs that have participated at least 10 times out of the 15 UEFA competitions. So that's for Champions League as well as UEFA competition. So I'll just bring this visual again, which shows the break-even result. And we can see the effect. So this is the total break-even result. The next slide shows us the difference, so where we split the clubs into control and treated group. So in this first graph, we can't really see a pattern and see whether financial fair play has improved things. Well, it goes up, goes down. But from here, we can see that for the target group, there's a clear shift away from, in terms of profitability. So this is the line for profitability. And for the control group, you can see that they more or less stayed the same way. But for the target group, you can see a clear departure, and it reached as high as almost 100 million at some point in time. So based on this, for our profitability, we used our YT is the outcome variable, and this was for our profitability. So we used profitability as well as other measures. So for our first regression, we ran our YIT is actually the break-even requirement. And then for other ones, so for the cash flow, sustainability, we used cash flow as a percentage of debt as our outcome variable for financial sustainability. So our results, we can see here that our target and post coefficient is our coefficient of interest. And we can see here that it's significant, and it's up 11.2. So what this tells us is that on an average, the introduction of financial fair play has led targeted clubs to be more profitable than the other clubs that are not exposed to financial fair play by, on an average, 11.2 million every year. And so, yeah, so that's what we have here. So we can see here from column 2 that for relevant income, we can see that there's a significant increase subsequent to the introduction of financial fair play. Same thing goes for relevant expenses. There's a significant increase. And however, the increase in relevant income is more significant than increase in relevant expenses. And that's why we have this. So it's positive and it's significant. Means that the profitability for targeted clubs has gone up significantly. And if we look back here, we can see that most clubs hovered around 0. However, we're now seeing from this result that clubs are more profitable by about 11 million, which is very, very high for the average football club. Now, going back to this slide, I'm going back to this visual, we can see that broadcast revenue is very high, very high. And since relevant income has gone up considerably, we believe that broadcast revenue had something to do here, because you can see the jump even from 2011 to 2019. The jump is very high. And going back, we have the data for the periods when the broadcast deals were negotiated. Between 2011 and 2022, the broadcast deals have been for 3 years. And we can see that from the nominally in 1992 it was 232 million, but as at 2019 it had gone up to about 9.2 billion. So what we did was to introduce another dummy variable for the years in which the broadcast deals were negotiated upwards. We can see that almost every single year the broadcast deals went up. So we included a dummy variable to see what actually happens, because our expectation is that profitability should always increase whenever clubs or whenever the broadcast revenue is increased. However, to our greatest surprise, we realized that the opposite is the case. Whenever the TV deals went up, on average, clubs were their profitability had gone down, so they were making losses their profitability had reduced by about 10.2 million averagely. And I mean, this is a bit of a departure from what we expected. So we looked at, this is the result for a particular club. And we realized that in the years when the TV deal was increased, BER reduced considerably to the 2 years beforehand. And the reason why this reduced was because of net transfer fee paid was increased. So clubs spent more on transfers. And you can see here that the wages and salaries as a percent, and the percentage change of wages and salaries always went up in the years when the broadcast deals were increased. So this tells us that clubs were increasingly spending more whenever TV deals came up. And if you notice here, in 2008, profitability went back up. So in the years of TV deal, clubs spent more and became less profitable because they had more money. And in the 2 subsequent years, it seems as though they adjusted to, having much more money. We included some other controls. So we included a control for attendance percentage, the amount attendance percentage, because I mean that's it's time varying. So we included that, and also we included a size control, that's log of total assets, and also we included a dummy variable for knockout, times when clubs in the control group reached the knockout phases of UEFA competitions, because once you go past the group stages, the money you receive from UEFA competitions is higher. And you can see that on average, clubs that went as far as the knockout stages had more, or rather their profitability increased. Including these variables, or including these control variables, did not significantly reduce our coefficient here. So it's still about 9.2 million. So we looked at salaries and wages as a percentage of total revenue, and we use this as our outcome variable. We also did the same thing for player expenses and also player sales and profits. And the thinking behind this is that the expectation is financial fair play should actually reduce salaries and wages as a percentage of revenue, which was what was predicted by Peters and Szymanski. However, what we can see here that didn't happen. In actual fact, salaries as a percentage of revenue got worse. So 0.146, it means that salaries as a percentage of revenue increased, and it was very significant. Also, we see here that player sales profits increased significantly. So if our salaries as a percentage of revenue did not increase significantly, or rather did not reduce significantly, but player sales profit increased, what that means is that clubs that were affected by financial fair play became more efficient in selling their players to balance their books and to remain profitable. This table here shows the player sales profit or loss for 3 of the targeted clubs before and post financial fair play. For Club 1, on average, the player sales profit was about 11.2 million, and they made losses in about 2.3 million on average before financial fair play. However, after financial fair play, it had skyrocketed to about 51 million, and they did not even make any losses. The same trend is seen for Club 2 and Club 3. Yes, so that's what happened. So one of the things that for our DID model is usually the parallel trends assumption is very, very key, and it's very hard to actually prove that there was a parallel trend before the intervention. So we carried out placebo tests. So the placebo test is more or less like introducing. So the first placebo test we carried out was to look at the pre-intervention period. So we took out all the post-intervention period. So this is a type of placebo test that can be run for robustness check for DID. So we took only the pre-intervention period, and we included a fake intervention period. So our pre-intervention period was 2005 to 2011, and we took 2008 as our intervention period. And we can see here that in terms of profitability, there's no significance. So the expectation is that there should not be any significance. Another possible way is pre and post intervention. So lumping up both of them, however, coming up with a fake intervention period. So instead of 2011, we picked 2009 to see if there was any significant causal impact. And we can see here that there was no significant causal impact. It's not significant. Another way of doing this is to introduce a random treatment group or a fake treatment group. So we did that in 2 ways and realized that there was no significant treatment. So this does not prove parallel trend, but it more or less just in a way lends a bit of support to it. And this is one of the areas that we're really open to getting suggestions from our statisticians and economics experts here on how we can actually try to do this in a better way. Now, in terms of financial sustainability, we looked at, as I mentioned, cash flow to debt. One of the findings we got was this, that cash flow to debt had increased. So the assumption here is that post-financial fair play, we expect this percentage to go up and to be positive. So it went up by about 0.14%. However, it's not significant. So this more or less shows that, yes, on an average, targeted clubs have a better cash flow to total debt ratio. However, it's not significant. When we see here, we can see that cash flow increased at a very, very significant rate. However, total debt increased much more, and that's why this is not so great, or rather, it's not so significant. And on the surface, we can say that financial fair play has not yet impacted financial sustainability of clubs, because what this means is, we can look at it because of the significant levels. However, in terms of econometric, in terms of commercial, in terms of significance, or rather in terms of magnitude, we can see that it has improved, but it's just not statistically significant. However, what we did was to have a look at debt composition for clubs. When we looked at debt composition for clubs, we could see here that over time, between 2005 and 2009, we can see that short-term debt, which is the which is highlighted by blue, has increased over time. Now, long-term debt instead has more or less stayed within the same range. What this means is that clubs, short-term debt means that clubs have to settle this debt within 1 year. Long-term debt, it means that it takes a longer time for them to settle their debt. So clubs are actually, from this, we can see that clubs, even though cash flow has increased, but clubs increasingly have a shorter time to pay up their debts, because short-term debts become payable faster than long-term debts. So that's one of the findings we got for financial sustainability. So even though the cash flow to debt and to total debt ratio has improved, the composition of the debt actually tells a different picture. And we believe that clubs are increasingly more exposed to cash shortfalls, which is what has always brought about financial fair play in the first place. So in terms of our findings, we found evidence to show, which points towards the fact that financial fair play has improved profitability. A classic case of financial fair play and what it has done is shown with this graph. This is Manchester City's break-even requirement, and we can see a V-shape, a perfect V-shape. So prior to financial fair play, losses were increasing. From financial fair play, it started increasing. I mean, this is probably one of the reasons why UEFA, and in addition to other evidences they had, or rather allegations, thought that Man City was beating, or rather they're being creative in bypassing financial fair play regulations. However, I mean, this is a model, and it shows that financial fair play has, in quote, achieved its purpose. So, also, our key findings are that clubs are less profitable when TV deals go up. Cash flow to total debt has improved, but it's not statistically significant. One of the reasons why short-term debt has increased is because clubs have increasingly used instrumental payments for player acquisition. So prior to financial fair play, clubs paid lump sums. But of recent times, we have seen that clubs say, or rather when they're buying players, they buy players based on installments. So they pay probably 100 million, instead of paying it at once, pay it or stagger the payment, pay it over 2-3 installments. So that's why short-term debt has increased. So our belief is that the increase in short-term debt exposes clubs to financial distress if a shock happens. And voila, we have COVID-19 now, or rather, COVID-19 has happened. And this shock has, there's a graph that I'll show afterwards, which shows what a shock can do to the finances of football clubs. One of the things that it does is that fans are not allowed into the stadium anymore. So match day revenue is almost non-existent again. So clubs are increasingly having to look for ways to balance their books. And James Reade, a few weeks back, spoke about when clubs will be allowed back into the stadium. And we're not sure when that would happen. However, clubs are increasingly saying that they want the fans to come back because they know that the finances are not great. This slide shows an extra from Manchester United's 2020 financial statement, which was released last week, Friday. This shows an early impact of COVID-19. So Manchester United historically has been a juggernaut in terms of finances. They have the highest commercial revenue, high broadcast revenue, high match day revenue. And this risk factor, the first risk factor that Manchester United highlighted was the risk of the pandemic. So it's affecting match day income, which would also probably affect broadcast revenue and even future broadcast revenue. And in terms of commercial revenue, I think the larger picture is that companies no longer have as much financial might to pay for some of these advertising contracts. For the first time in almost 10 years, Man United reported, or rather their break-even became negative. So these are the early signs of what COVID-19 or an external shock can do. Also, for the first time in about 10 years, Manchester United's cash flow was negative. That never, or rather since 2011, it hadn't happened. And we can see here that short-term debt has really increased for Manchester United. We can see here that the matchday revenue for 2020 is not so low. So in 2020, it's still high. The reason why it's high is because majority of the games were played before COVID happened, before the lockdown happened. However, now we expect that this will almost disappear. So if fans are not allowed back, this would almost necessarily almost disappear here. So our recommendations based on this is financial fair play has improved profitability. It should be adopted by all clubs. So it should not just be clubs in UEFA club competitions. So it should be fully adopted by all clubs to improve profitability. We also believe that there should be an adjustment to financial fair play to bring in, and one of our suggestions is to probably bring in a capital requirement, something that is similar to the Basel III for banks, which we believe would actually make clubs, or rather it would improve the financial sustainability, because clubs would spend less money, in terms of will have a financial buffer to meet their financial needs. Thank you for listening. Questions and suggestions are highly welcome. This is, as I said, this is a work in progress, and there are some of we need as much suggestions for us to progress the paper. I think majorly we need things around covariates, things that we can also include as controls. We've considered matching for our diff and diff, also propensity score matching also, and we agree that there's a possibility for permanent differences between our treatment and control groups. So I'll stop here for questions and suggestions, please.
Thank you, Mobolaji. Really interesting talk. You'll be pleased to know that Linda and Andrew have been in the chat room answering questions. So I think, let me just check. Linda did, because there was a recent question from Jorge about the UEFA payments for Champions League and Europa League. Jorge asked whether they should be controlled for in terms of, I guess, when you're looking at break even for the clubs. Oh,
sorry, that's in terms of the payments, right? The payments to the club
for getting to the knockout stages or whatever.
Oh, we controlled for teams that got into the knockout stage. We put a control for, or except if he's thinking about it in another way, and I think I'm open to hearing that. But we control for clubs that got into the knockout.
I think Jorge's referring to the financial payments that come from UEFA for reaching the stages.
Okay. Oh, the financial payments. So the amounts, right? Like, yeah. Probably. Okay. I think that's a good suggestion, a great suggestion. But I think the only I think that's something that I'll think to include, because I was going to say that it's going to be difficult to find out how much it is, but UEFA actually puts out that data, so we can definitely include it. Thank you very much. We'll definitely include that.
Okay, but given that basically the various questions that are in the chat have been fielded by Andrew and Linda, what I think is best to do is to move on to an open Q&A, and Stefan has his hand up. So Stefan, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. So that was very interesting, and I enjoyed that a lot. And but of course I'm sure you're expecting that I'm going to come back on some of the points, particularly your conclusion, right? So yeah. So the paper's great if you just delete the last slide, because that's the bit that's completely wrong. Of course, that's just my opinion. Of course, you could. All I would say is, though, that it's just. I do think if you're going to say that, I'd like to see you answer the question why you think financial stability is a problem in the world of football, given that insolvency rates are, if anything, lower than in industry in general. I've looked at that data. It's also true that none of these clubs ever disappear. So why is it a problem if that's happening? And also entertain the hypothesis that there might be other reasons that cause insolvency other than financial regulations. But to raise some specific points on the things that you said, I think the one thing in your econometrics you need to worry about is the evidence that revenues go up, because clearly it's really hard to think of a good story about why financial fair play should cause revenues to go up. It seems it's reasonable to think that it might control costs in some way, and it's but that seems to be the one thing that's difficult to explain. And as you say, there are plenty of other things going on at the time. Particularly, I think the obvious one, and I think you mentioned it several times, is the broadcast revenues going up.
Yeah.
This coincided with big increases in broadcast revenues, and it's really hard to disentangle that. One suggestion for sort of trying to get at that, and kind of technical approach, is I've been working on a paper with Gidon Jacob for some time now about new stadiums in English football, and we've been thinking about those in terms of difference models. And one thing we've been trying there is to isolate the effects of other effects is the Blinder Oaxaca decomposition, which enables you to get some sense of whether other factors are actually driving these changes. So I'd suggest that as something you might want to try. Then just two more points. I think you did briefly mention in the chat, there are these, the Premier League has its own financial rules, regulations, which apply to the spending of clubs, which were introduced about the same time. Now, I forget exactly when they were and what they were, but I think, one possibility is that those rules serve to restrain the smaller clubs, the clubs that were not affected by the UEFA financial fair play, and that's, if there is an effect, maybe it's holding back the smaller clubs through the Premier League's own rules rather than restraining the big clubs through the UEFA rules. And then the final point I want to make is about the point you made about debt. I'm a little bit skeptical about debt figures because most of this debt is non-commercial. Apart from Manchester United and Arsenal, most of these debts are really soft. And so they're loans from directors, owners, which are not necessarily subject to repayment. So in that sense, I'm not sure that debt is a very realistic figure for most clubs.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Stefan. I anticipated that you were going to mention some of those points. You can see that the paper is littered with a lot of your work, but I'll start from the last point in terms of the debt for some of the clubs. I agree that most of the debt is non-commercial majorly. However, what I found is that a lot of the clubs, because of their using installmental payments, so short-term debt has gone up, and short-term debt is what they owe to other clubs. So what that might do is that, so for example, if maybe Leicester City, or rather Manchester United, probably has a financial issue today. Leicester City, who are expecting payments from Manchester United. So the current short-term debt in Manchester United would be a current asset in Leicester City. So what that means is that if Manchester United is unable to pay, that would invariably affect Leicester City. So that's one of the reasons why we highlighted that. But I agree with your point, larger point, which says that to a large extent, the directors are owed most of the money. Well, that's for in terms of longer-term debt. But in terms of short-term debt, is majorly other clubs, HMRC, the tax authorities, and other creditors. In terms of financial, the restriction, the Premier League restriction. So financial fair play, or rather, for the EFL, that's the championship clubs, right? They have a more stringent regulation. So they have something that is styled very close to what UEFA has, but we are looking at clubs in the Premier League, not in the Championship. However, I know that there's something called the financial sustainability, short-term cost control measure that was introduced in the Premier League. Now, it was introduced, I think, in 2000, and it was not around this. It wasn't around 2011. It was around 2000, and if I'm not mistaken, 15. And it was literally a situation where clubs, it was a situation where the Premier League required clubs to not increase wages by a certain amount if it's not covered by revenue. So if a club does not have an increase in revenue by probably 10 million, for example, they cannot increase their wages by 7 million, of which, because of the how large the broadcast revenue is, almost every single club passed it. So for me, it's the a short-term cost control is not necessarily a regulation, because almost every single club will pass it. And then the sanctions were, I don't think I heard of any club that has been sanctioned as a result of short-term cost control. The first point you mentioned, please could you just repeat that? And the first question you raised, because I think I've answered the last two, but the first one, I'm not.
Sorry, which question was that? I'm
the first point you made.
Yeah. The first point was made is that you have to. It's the general point about deleting your last slide. Is that why is there a reason to think that financial sustainability is actually a problem? There's less insolvency in football clubs than there is in the business world in general. Football clubs never disappear, they're always resurrected. And why should we even think that it's to do with this when promotion and relegation is probably the most likely explanation?
I agree that promotion and relegation, because I mean, when you look at some of the clubs, Bolton, for example, had significant financial issues, and it was only when they got, I think, to League Two that started having financial distress. I agree with you on that. And when the comparison you made with other industries, I agree 100% that football clubs are more or less like banks and probably too big to fail. However, as you mentioned, football club, what happens in the football industry is not, doesn't really translate to what happens elsewhere. However, that in itself is a unique issue, because in the same period where other clubs are rather other companies are reporting financial losses or reduced revenue, or when the Eurozone was contracting because of the financial crisis, football was going up, right? So it means that there's a unique issue there. But when we look at the details and look at the fact that broadcast revenues are very high, which is what has caused for that, match day revenue has been consistent because fans will keep on going in because of loyalty, right? However, with a very unlikely shock, which has become likely, or which has actually come to fruition, like COVID-19, might actually cause a big issue. And I think that was one of the reasons why the big picture argument was brought into place, to say that, and this is more or less the club executive saying that there's a big issue here, things might go bust, and we might run into a lot of trouble. So historically, it's only clubs that get relegated that start having financial issues. I mean, Bury FC, Wigan Athletic. So I agree with you. However, I believe that with clubs currently going through an issue like COVID-19, who knows when fans will be allowed back into the stadium? If fans are not allowed back into the stadium for this whole season, Manchester United is going to lose about, because they're in the Champions League now, almost 110 million. And I mean, you can already see that with the little effect of COVID-19, Manchester United's cash flow has gone negative for the first time in almost 10 years. So if fans are not allowed back into the stadium, I think that we might be in for a situation where big clubs, not the ones that are relegated, start to get into financial distress, and it might really be very bad. That's my thinking about it. But I agree with you to a large extent. If everything is as it stands, if status quo is maintained, football clubs would never die. I agree.
Thanks, Mobolaji. Thanks, Stefan. Thomas Peters has his hand up.
You're muted. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Okay. So yes. So first thing, thanks for the paper. Quite interesting to see this sort of analysis being done. I think very relevant as well. One thing that I have to suggest sort of is I couldn't see the chat window is what I'm first going to say. I joined in some way that I couldn't see it, so I don't know if I'm repeating someone else's remark. But the empirical part seems to be a little bit confounded by the fact that you only look at England, so that the revenue effects from, for example, the TV deal, they would affect the majority of all of your clubs, the ones in your treatment and control group. And as we said, when these revenues go up sort of out of the blue without that there's that might be something exogenous to financial fair play. And then the question is barely how much of these extra revenues are saved by the clubs and sort of spent. What you could do to help in that respect is to look at to actually extend your sample to countries where that didn't see this sort of increase that England has seen. And if it can be of any help, at Erasmus we are in the process of collecting. Well, we have collected actually the financial statements for quite a few countries, and we're happy to share those with you if you're interested in adding to your data. And extending your paper to other countries. So I think that would be quite interesting to see, because then you sort of get out of the. So there are some countries in Europe that have not seen the same expansion in revenues than the Premier League has. So that might help you to get a little bit of more variation on that end of your data set. So that's my suggestion. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'll send you a mail to try and get
Yes.
the additional financial
Please do.
statements. Yeah, thank you. I think I'll just leave it that way. But one of the reasons why we honed in on the Premier League, I think adding other countries would be fantastic. Clubs from other countries would be fantastic. So we'll definitely do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Mo. Thanks, Thomas. We'll try and fix your chat room issues between now and next week, Thomas.
I think it's because I joined through the calendar, James. I had this with Erasmus meetings too. So I don't think it's something. It's Teams' fault. It's Bill Gates is at fault here.
So the issue is joining through the calendar. This is good information because lots of people aren't able to see the chat. So if that, maybe that's how it is. So if you join through the team itself rather than through the calendar.
Yes.
Ah, fantastic. New knowledge, new information. Go on.
Okay. I'm seeing a question here from Kruma Alexander. He said whether the results are reversed to different definitions of control and treatment groups. So what we did was to even come up with some alternative definitions of the treated group. However, we're limited in this case because, I mean, annually, only about 6 clubs from England are defined as treated, or rather get into UEFA competitions. However, we did an alternative definition. So the first definition was at least 10 out of 15 Champions League. That was the baseline definition. 10 out of 15 Champions League participations, and then we reduced it to say 6 out of 15. So we did that. However, I mean, we're limited. So I think what Thomas mentioned would help us to expand that. And we also, so I think that to answer that, that's what we'll do. So we'll get something better from when we get the additional data.
Great, thanks, Mobolaji. I was about to point you to Alex's question, so thanks, Alex, as well. Do you have any follow-up, Alex? Do you want to ask anything else, or?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Any more questions and comments for Mobolaji?
I'll have another go if no one else wants to.
Go on, Stefan.
Yeah. So I think the other really interesting thing. I mean, let's say that there is you can nail down that there is an effect here, that the profitability in some sense has increased. That still doesn't really answer the question about why it would have increased, right? So you could say that these regulations. So if you ask UEFA why profitability would have increased, they would say, well, they're more efficient, they're making better decisions. But the other possibility is since maybe this is inhibiting the control group. Maybe what's happening here is that these regulations are actually impacting the control group because they can't take actions that would enable them to compete with the treatment group, because they would have to violate the financial fair play regulations in order to reach the competitive level required, and then they'd immediately be thrown out of the competition because they were in violation of the financial fair play. So, are you prepared to argue that this is really an improvement in efficiency, or are you prepared to entertain that alternative hypothesis?
I think a bit of both. The reason why, because UEFA, in their benchmark reports, they say that financial fair play has worked, and UEFA is still adamant that it has worked. Still adamant. However, when we look at the data, you can see the behavior of some of the clubs. So it has led to a behavioral change. The graph for Manchester City shows that just as financial fair play came, Manchester City became more cautious in spending. Manchester United too has been preaching sustainable purchases. Yes, so if I can argue that, I can, to a large extent, looking at the behavior in terms of what has actually led to clubs being less profitable in time past, which was wages paid to players, amount spent on transfer fees. So I can counter the argument to say, hey, since after financial fair play, wages has gone up, transfer fees have gone up. However, income has also gone up. However, what we are seeing now, I think that the key thing is to see what happens after COVID. The reason why is because this is the first time that football clubs are getting into an uncomfortable position where income is no longer short. So then what do? And that's what we can see. Some of the evidence from this transfer window lends or tells us about that, because the one example that I can isolate is Jadon Sancho, the purchase of Jadon Sancho. There are reports that Manchester United did not want to pay 120 million. If COVID had not happened, there are reports that they would have paid. So to a large extent, you can see that financial fair play is achieving something. Implicitly, one of the things that they mentioned is that they were trying to bring rationality. So it's not a case of don't spend, it's spend within your means. So if clubs, when income is shrinking, are reducing their expenses, UEFA can argue that yes, financial fair play has done something fantastic. And if there was no financial fair play, I can just imagine what would have happened in this period. And then to your point about whether financial fair play is inhibiting smaller clubs, yes, I agree. If so, like for example, Newcastle was almost taken over by the Saudis, and what that would have done is that they would have been able to compete as much if financial fair play wasn't there. So you look at what happened in 2003, 2004 when Abramovich took over. They were able to wrestle the likes of Manchester United, and also what happened with with Man City, and they were able to wrestle. However, it's very difficult to see whether that can happen today because of the financial fair play restrictions. However, a counter argument might be if the Saudis had taken over Newcastle, what we would have seen is Newcastle was not exposed to financial fair play. So they will have probably taken about 2 or 3 seasons, spent a lot of money, right, and got into a place where they were big enough, right, because they were not exposed to financial fair play, and they'll have gotten more commercial deals. They would have probably finished 5th or 6th or something, and they will have spent, and they will have been able to assemble a very good squad, and then they'll have been able to challenge. However, the alternative thing is to also look at it and see that we're seeing a focus away from spending. So you look at the likes of what has happened with Leicester City, for example. That's one-off season where they won the league, and afterwards they have actually stayed in and around being, within. From a club that came from relegation, won the league, and now last year they qualified for the UEFA League. So they've been able to organically grow. So that argument can be either way. So I think that I agree with you that it could be that financial fair play has inhibited clubs, but at the same time too, even for the big clubs too, now they're a bit more careful about their spending, and it's making things. But I think it's peculiar in England because of the broadcast deal, and it means that on average, I can't remember the exact figures, but at some point in time, West Brom, I think in 2016, had the same amount of money from broadcast deal as Bayern Munich. So I mean, that in the Premier League shows you how big the Premier League is. So that's one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on the Premier League, because it gives us a unique sense of I mean, where everybody has money. Everybody has a large pool of money to start from.
One thing I'd encourage you to look at, and you did mention it in your talk, but I think you could look at it in a bit more detail, is the issue of the anticipatory effects. Because clearly, knowing that financial fair play was coming, then clubs had an incentive to, spend big, knowing that they were going to face restraints afterwards. So I think if you could check more carefully to see whether those anticipatory effects exist, I think that would help. We
actually briefly looked at that. So if you notice, so I'll just share my screen again just to highlight that if we have enough time. So we kind of saw that in 2000 and yes. So if you notice in 2010, we can see that for the targeted groups, all of a sudden from a high in 2009, it went down to very low here. And interestingly, financial fair play, though it came into effect in 2011, 2011's financials was given as a grace period, more or less. So it was only for 2013 monitoring period, UEFA only looked at 2013 and 2012. So you can see here, that's why in 2010 it was low, 2011 it was low, but it started going up afterwards. So we can see that there was an anticipatory effect here. However, I mean, there's a lot of limitations around that, because the DID model, more or less, or an assumption is that there's no anticipatory effect. So that's one of the reasons, one of the things that we're trying to address before we can speak about that, because DID more or less says that there should not be any anticipatory effect. But at the same time, too, financial fair play was announced in 2009. So to a large extent, there's an anticipatory effect. So we're just looking at how to get around that and ensure that we're not making any biased conclusions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mobolaji. Thank you for a very interesting talk. Thank you to everyone for your comments. There's been lots of action in the chat window. And now everyone knows how to access it next week if they didn't know this week. So thank you to Thomas and Stefan for their pioneering work in working that out. What I'm going to leave you with for this week is to point towards next week. And there's a slight bit of excitement ahead next week, because we've got a new style of poster. And now hopefully you can see that. Obviously, this is highly exciting, but now we have a new style of poster for our Roses event. This is living the high life. But next week, we're going to have Juan de Moreno Tenero, who's going to present on broadcasting La Liga. So we're going to carry on with the broadcasting perspective. And that's going to be next week, same time, which is going to be confusing again for those of our North American based guests who will have to again adjust to a different time to join us. But in the meantime, I wish you all a fantastic rest of your week, however long of it's left, a great weekend, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. So thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.